The fluorescent lights at the Denver bus stop hummed their tired mechanical drone, casting everything in a sickly white that made the early morning look like it was happening inside a hospital already. Danielle Ross stood with her badge clipped to her scrubs, the laminate catching the light in quick flashes as she shifted her weight from one foot to the other. Route 47 was 17 minutes late. She could feel the pull of Cedar Creek Medical in her chest, the way a compass needle trembles toward true north. The bus stop smelled like diesel exhaust and the ghost of someone spilled coffee from yesterday. She'd chosen this stop deliberately, 2 blocks from the hospital, far enough that no one who mattered would see her arriving in uniform. Anonymity was protocol. Invisibility was the mission. A man appeared beside her without announcement. Captain Michael Torres, though Danielle didn't yet know his name. He was tall, the kind of tall that suggested military bearing even in civilian clothes, and he was moving in small increments, a shoulder roll, a neck stretch, the kind of unconscious adjustments people make when their bodies are starting to betray them. His eyes held a vagueness that made her nursing instincts activate before her conscious mind caught up. She watched him in her peripheral vision, the way she'd learned to observe without staring. His left hand trembled slightly as he reached into his jacket pocket. A slight slur in his breathing. A faint asymmetry in his facial features that took her 30 seconds to catalogue, drooping right mouth corner, right eye not opening quite as far as the left. Danielle turned toward him with the careful deliberation of someone reaching for a patient's wrist to check a pulse. When did it start? Her voice was quiet, the kind of quiet that commands attention without demanding it. Torres blinked at her as if she'd materialized out of the bus shelter's shadow. What? The tingling. The weakness. When did you first notice it? She was already running through the Cincinnati pre-hospital stroke scale in her head, facial drooping, yes, arm weakness, testing now, speech changes, yes, and her hand was moving toward her scrub pocket where her phone lived like a weapon. I'm fine, he said, but his words came out shaped wrong, the consonants not quite landing. Just didn't sleep. Danielle didn't argue. People in medical crisis often denied it with the same ferocity they deny a loaded gun. She dialed 911 with her free hand, her other hand already reaching for his arm to guide him to sit on the metal bench. The bench was cold, the kind of cold that made you understand why homeless people carried cardboard. The dispatcher answered on the second ring. Danielle's voice became something different, clinical, precise, the voice of someone who'd done this before, 42-year-old male, acute facial drooping, arm weakness, speech slurring. Probable acute ischemic stroke. For minutes since onset. Denver bus stop at Lincoln and 4th. We need medic for priority. The dispatcher confirmed. For minutes. In a stroke, for minutes was the difference between recovery and catastrophe. Time wasn't measured in seconds at this point, time was measured in neurons dying by the thousands. She kept Torres seated, kept his body still, kept him from trying to stand up and walk it off the way men like him always tried. She checked his pupils. She asked him his name. She asked him what day it was. The answers came back wrong, fragmented, the kind of wrong that meant his brain was literally being strangled by a blood clot. The ambulance arrived in 6 minutes, the sirens cutting through the Denver morning like a blade. The paramedics, a woman named Chen and a man whose name patch read Rodriguez, moved with the casual efficiency of people who'd done this 700 times. Danielle gave them the handoff in the language of medicine, sudden onset facial droop and arm weakness for minutes ago, speech slurred, right-sided weakness, possible anterior circulation stroke, vital stable but trending toward tachycardia, no reported allergies, no medications, does not know current date or day of week. Chen nodded. We're going to Cedar Creek. We're going to Cedar Creek, Danielle confirmed. But she was already climbing into the ambulance before they could tell her not to. As a civilian, she shouldn't have been permitted. But the authority in her voice, the way she moved, the fact that she'd already started an assessment, all of it read as medical staff. Nobody questioned her. She rode in the back with Torres as the ambulance moved through Denver traffic with the arrogance of someone immune to traffic laws, and she stayed focused on his vitals, on watching his oxygen saturation, on noting every small degradation that suggested the clot was still claiming territory in his brain. Cedar Creek Medical came up fast, the main entrance rising like a ship breaching water. The bay doors opened. The stretcher rolled out. Danielle moved alongside it with the stretcher team, maintaining continuity of care, giving the ER team the same crisp handoff. Captain Michael Torres, sudden onset acute ischemic stroke, left MCA territory, for minutes from onset, no thrombolytics contraindicated, CT angiogram and CTA head ordered, neuro check Q 5 minutes. She used his military rank without thinking. The habit lived in her voice like a scar lives in skin. And that was when Dr. Raymond Mercer stepped through the double doors of the ambulance bay, his jaw tightening as he watched her. His eyes moved across her face for exactly 3 seconds, the kind of look a predator gives when it identifies a threat it had thought was already dead. Danielle felt the moment register in her chest, not fear, not exactly, but the sharp awareness of a door she'd hoped remained closed suddenly swinging open. She held his gaze for 2 seconds longer than necessary, then turned back to Torres, her hand never leaving the stretcher rail. Mercer was the reason she was here. Mercer was the entire mission. For 18 months, the Navy had been tracking opioid diversion at Cedar Creek Medical, watching pharmaceutical supplies vanish from the narcotic cabinet in patterns too regular to be accident, watching billing codes for pain management appearing on patients who'd never received pain management. The investigation had traced everything back to him, Dr. Raymond Mercer, Chief of Emergency Medicine, who had access to the locked cabinets and the authority to order whatever medications he wanted without questions. The investigation suspected he'd been diverting pharmaceuticals worth approximately $340,000 a year, selling them through criminal networks that moved them down the I-25 corridor into the streets. 3 bodies had been attributed to pills that came from his cabinet. 3 families destroyed. Danielle had been placed in Cedar Creek as a floor nurse specifically to document his prescribing patterns, to catch him in the act of falsifying records, to build enough evidence that federal prosecutors could take him down. She was Captain Danielle Ross, United States Navy, decorated combat veteran, trained in reconnaissance and surveillance and the particular skill of disappearing into plain sight. Her scrubs were the perfect cover, nurses were everywhere and nowhere, visible but unmemorable, trusted enough to move through hospitals but insignificant enough that doctors rarely looked twice at them. The problem was that Torres recognized her. On some level, deeper than consciousness, his body knew her. Danielle had pulled him from a burning HMMWV in Baghdad 9 years ago, dragging him clear of an IED blast that had taken his left leg 6 inches below the knee. She'd kept pressure on the wound while rounds snapped overhead. She'd stayed with him through the medevac. She was the last face he'd seen in the combat hospital before the traumatic brain injury took his memories and replaced them with fog. In the months that followed, Torres had discovered her name, her call sign, really, the designation that had followed her through 3 combat tours, Valkyrie. Someone had inked it on his forearm in thick black letters, a permanent marker of gratitude and connection. But the brain injury had stolen his ability to remember her face. He knew the name. He knew intellectually that she'd saved his life. He didn't know her. And if Mercer saw Torres, if Mercer heard Torres say her name, if Mercer realized who she actually was and why she was really here, the entire operation would collapse. The investigation would lose its most critical witness, the man who could testify to the medications that had been prescribed to him, the patterns of overcounting that suggested diversion, the entire chain of evidence that prosecutors needed. Mercer was already turning away, already walking back into the hospital, his expression unreadable. But Danielle had seen that look before. It was the look a predator gives when it realizes it's being hunted. She smoothed the thin blanket on Torres's stretcher and followed them inside. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical song as Danielle entered Cedar Creek Medical through the staff entrance, her scrubs still damp from the ambulance ride. Torres had been stabilized in trauma too. She'd given her report to the charge nurse, clean handoff, vitals documented, timeline precise. Everything by protocol. Everything invisible. She was halfway to the locker room when she heard it. Mercer's voice, pitched loud enough to carry through the nursing station, pulled her toward the bulletin board like a hook through ribs. A sheet of paper had been posted beneath the daily announcements. Medication error incident report. Her name centered at the top. The word swam. Failed to verify patient identity before forepush. Danielle's pulse stayed level, years of training held it there, but her eyes scanned the narrative Mercer had constructed. Precise. Fabricated. Signed by him at 3:16 a.m., before Torres had even arrived. Ross. Mercer materialized beside her, his voice smooth as oil over concrete. His presence made the air pressure change. We need to talk about this. She turned slowly. His white coat was pressed to hospital corner precision, and his face arranged itself into the expression of a man disappointed by a subordinate's incompetence. Stage 1, the performance for an audience. 3 nurses stood behind the counter. 2 residents passed in the hallway. The timing was deliberate. This error, Mercer continued, his words landing like surgical cuts, put a patient at risk. It's exactly the kind of carelessness we don't tolerate at Cedar Creek. He stepped closer, his voice dropping just enough that people had to lean in to hear it. You're a bright enough girl, but sometimes bright isn't enough. You lack the judgment. The instinct. The presence, really, that separates the good nurses from the merely competent ones. The word sat there. Girl. Not woman. Not nurse. Girl, small, unfinished, incapable. Danielle took one measured breath. Her jaw remained loose. Her hand stayed at her sides. When she spoke, her voice carried the texture of absolute certainty. I trust the record will speak for itself, Doctor. She held his eyes, steady, unbroken contact, and watched his expression flicker. He'd expected crumbling. Tears. A defensive stumble. Instead, he got a woman who refused to perform fear for him. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. We'll discuss the corrective action plan at your next shift, he said finally, turning away with a gesture that was supposed to dismiss her entirely. It didn't work. She was still standing there, still breathing, still refusing to disappear. One of the nurses, Sarah Chen, who'd worked nights with Danielle for 6 months, looked away quickly and busied herself with a chart. The other nurse, Ramirez, actually turned around. Not leaving, exactly. But closing the conversation off, the way you close a door when you hear shouting from the other room. Danielle walked to the locker room alone. The next shift brought the break room assassination. She was pouring coffee at 6:23 a.m. when 4 nurses came in together, their rhythm already practiced. They stopped when they saw her. The collective inhale was almost visible. Hey, one of them said, Jamie, from pediatrics, whose daughter Danielle had once helped get into a summer program at Denver Medical. We've got stuff. Schedules. They grabbed their lunches, deliberately left on the counter, and left without sitting down. The last one, Marcus, actually mumbled an apology as he passed, his eyes tracking the floor tiles instead of her face. Danielle sat alone with the fluorescent lights and the smell of microwave chicken teriyaki, and she understood perfectly. Mercer had made the calculation simple for them, align with him or be marked. It wasn't malice. It was survival math. Self-preservation dressed up as professionalism. She drank the coffee anyway. By the end of her 4th day, the isolation had architecture. Danielle would enter a room and find the previous shift nurse had left equipment in the wrong place, not by accident, but by instruction, she realized. Charts appeared unsigned. A medication order got lost between pharmacy and the floor. When she asked the charge nurse about the Torres family visit scheduled for afternoon, the answer came back tightly. Dr. Mercer requested you be reassigned to the 3rd floor post-op wing during that time. Not requested. It wasn't a request. It was exile, dressed in the language of efficiency. She was pulling medications for her new assignment, sterile field on the 3rd floor, different patients, different hallways, maximum distance from Torres and any narrative that might attach gratitude to her name when she saw the shift changed on the schedule. Her name had been moved. Then moved again. For different times in 72 hours. The message was clear. Keep her rotating. Keep her visible but not valuable. Keep her present but not present. That evening, sitting in her apartment with the city lights bleeding orange through the windows, Danielle pulled out the folded flag from her locker, the fabric from a fallen teammate's final deployment, pressed and creased with prayers she hadn't spoken out loud in 7 years. She held it between her palms, and for the first time since boarding the ambulance with Torres, something inside her chest cracked. Not publicly. Never publicly. But here, alone, with the weight of a mission disintegrating like tissue paper, she let herself understand what was happening. She was losing. Not to Mercer's competence. He was merely competent, a man with leverage and the network to weaponize it. He'd made calls. She knew because information moved differently now. The board president had been informed. Her nursing school references had received calls asking carefully worded questions about her stability. An outside HR investigator was being brought in. She'd overheard that much from the administrative office when she'd been delivering a chart. Mercer was dismantling her the way surgeons dismantle tumors. Systematically. Without emotion. With the absolute certainty that he had more resources than she did. And he was winning. The folded flag sat in her hands, still holding the creases from its last deployment. Danielle had carried this through 3 continents and 6 years of civilian life. She'd never let anyone see it. Never explained it. Never let it become evidence. Now it was all she had left. She placed it carefully in the bottom of her locker, beneath her second spare scrubs, and prepared for the night shift that would probably be her last. The hospital was waiting. Mercer was waiting. And somewhere on the 2nd floor, Captain Michael Torres was recovering from a stroke that a nurse he couldn't remember had prevented from becoming a death. She dressed in fresh scrubs and headed back into the fluorescent darkness. The emergency call came at 2:13 a.m. The monitor shrieked once. That single sound split the moment into before and after. Captain Torres's chest went rigid. The rhythm on the screen deteriorated from organized beats into a chaotic scrawl, ventricular fibrillation. His body seized. A nurse shouted, "Code Blue, cardiac care unit, now," and the room became controlled chaos, but it was the wrong kind. Danielle was 2 floors away, restocking a supply cart on the medical surgical unit when the overhead system crackled, "Code Blue, CCU, Code Blue." She knew that code. She'd heard it in Fallujah too, though the announcements had come through radio static instead of hospital intercoms. Her hand stopped moving. Inventory forgotten. The elevator doors opened on the 3rd floor and she moved. Not jogging. Not running. Walking with the precision of someone who had learned long ago that panic burned oxygen. The cardiac care unit occupied the north wing. Danielle knew the layout because she'd spent the first 3 weeks mapping every exit, every supply closet, every camera blind spot, a habit from fieldwork that never really left you. She pushed through the double doors at 2:16 a.m., and what she saw made her blood pressure drop in ways only combat training could suppress. Code team at the bedside. Dr. Mercer barking orders. Torres on the bed, bare chest exposed, defibrillator pads already placed. But something was wrong. Danielle read the 4 lines, the medication drips, the chart hanging at the foot of the bed. Her eyes moved across the list of medications administered in the past 4 hours, and her lungs nearly stopped. Amiodarone and metoprolol. Both contraindicated in someone with Torres's cardiac history. Both negative inotropes. Both would tank his heart rate further, would suppress contractility exactly when he needed force. Someone had ordered them deliberately. Someone had wanted this. Danielle's jaw tightened. Mercer stood at the head of the bed, chest compressions ongoing, shouting at the respiratory team, "Push another round of epi, now." Wrong protocol. The epi would spike his adrenaline into an already destabilized rhythm. It was like throwing accelerant on a controlled fire and expecting containment. Her voice dropped. An octave. 2. Stop compressions. The room didn't pause. The chest compressions continued. The resident kept his hands on Torres's sternum, mechanically counting, 28, 29, 30. Danielle moved. Not asking. Not requesting. The authority in her presence made heads turn. I said stop. She was at the bedside now, and her hands that had stitched wound track patterns in the sandstorms of Anbar province, reached for the defibrillator. The resident hesitated. Danielle's eyes met his for exactly 1 second. That was enough. Compression stopped. Mercer's face darkened. Nurse, step back. You're not in. Cardiac rhythm is fine v-fib. The medications are the problem. Her voice carried no uncertainty. It was a statement of fact, delivered like someone reading longitude coordinates. He's on amiodarone and metoprolol. Both negative inotropes. They're suppressing the heart rate he needs to convert. You're treating the rhythm instead of the cause. The silence lasted 3 seconds. On the monitor, Torres's heart flatlined completely. Asystole. The worst rhythm of all. Mercer's face went crimson. Nurse, I will have security remove you from this room. Danielle ignored him. She was already moving toward the medication cart, muscle memory taking over. She pulled a vial, atropine, 1 milligram, and handed it to the nurse. Her hands were steady as a surgical laser. Push this. And get me a reversal agent for the beta blocker. We need his heart rate up, not suppressed. Bradycardia this severe, he won't perfuse. She didn't look at Mercer. Didn't acknowledge his existence. The room had become its own universe, and rank no longer mattered. Only the patient mattered. You are overstepping your authority, Mercer said. His voice had gone quiet. Dangerous. I'm saving his life. She turned to face him. Her eyes were empty of everything except clarity. And you know exactly why those medications were ordered. Mercer moved like something struck. He grabbed Danielle's arm, pulled her from the bedside with force that was supposed to break her composure. His grip was hard enough to bruise. You are insubordinate. You are removing yourself from this room immediately, or I will have you terminated on the spot. Danielle pulled free with the economical movement of someone who had trained to escape holds. She didn't rub her arm. Didn't acknowledge the pain. Instead, she stepped past him and locked her eyes on the crash cart across the room. The scalpel sat exactly where it should be, sterile wrapped in its designated slot. Number 10 blade. She'd held this exact instrument configuration in operating theaters with mortars landing 5 blocks away. She'd used it to perform an emergency chest decompression when a Marine with a tension pneumothorax was drowning in his own blood and the closest surgeon was 20 minutes away by Black Hawk. The memory wasn't a flashback. It was muscle memory asserting itself through her nervous system. Her hand moved before her brain caught up with the decision. The scalpel came free from its wrap. The fluorescent lights overhead cast no shadows, just harsh clinical brightness that made everything brutal and real. Torres's heart was still flatlined. Asystole. A rhythm incompatible with life if it continued more than 4 minutes. The clock was already running. What are you doing? One of the residents whispered. Danielle didn't answer. She walked into the hallway, where the air smelled of antiseptic and the faint copper scent of equipment sterilization. Torres's room was behind her now. She could hear Mercer shouting something about security, about legal action, about having her arrested. The sound seemed to come from very far away. The hallway tiles were cold under her feet. She'd learned in Baghdad that tile floors were the best surfaces for field procedures. They drain lead easily, they were cleanable, they didn't absorb dried blood. The same principles applied here, though for different reasons. She positioned herself with Torres's chart in clear view. His vital signs were still being transmitted by wireless telemetry. She could see them on a wall-mounted monitor, flatline on the screen. Heart rate 0. Time 0. Danielle's hands moved with the precision of someone operating in muscle memory so deep it didn't require thought. The scalpel found the 5th intercostal space, mid-axillary line. She worked with the efficiency of field surgery, making an incision through skin, fascia, muscle. The blade bit through tissue, and her own breathing remained controlled because panic was a luxury soldiers couldn't afford. Blood welled up. She used a sterile for gauze to clear it, and there, the pericardium, the tough fibrous sac surrounding the heart. The scalpel penetrated. The sac opened. Fluid rushed out, pericardial effusion, the backup of fluid that had been compressing the heart, strangling it, preventing it from beating. The fluid drained onto the sterile field she'd positioned below the incision site. Her hands worked automatically, efficiently, without hesitation. "Get me a chest tube," she said to the nurse who'd followed her into the hallway. The nurse stared at her like she'd started speaking Pashto. "The 14 gauge, now." The chest tube went in. Danielle positioned it in the pericardial space, securing it with a single suture and tape. Blood loss was minimal. The procedure took 90 seconds. Behind her, she could hear Mercy shouting at security guards. She could hear boots running. But on the telemetry monitor, something changed. The flat line converted. One beat. Then another. The heart rate climbed. 50. 60. 70. 80. Danielle's hand stilled. She hadn't realized they were moving until they stopped. The chest tube was secure. The effusion was drained. Torres's perfusion pressure would come back online within minutes. His kidneys would start functioning again. His brain would get oxygen. "Sinus rhythm," she said quietly. The telemetry confirmed it. A perfect, regular heartbeat on the monitor. Torres was alive. Security guards arrived at exactly 2:22 a.m. They grabbed Danielle's arms, pulled her away from the wall monitor where she was watching the heart rate stabilize at 88 beats per minute. She didn't resist. She simply submitted, her body going passive while her mind remained somewhere above herself, observing the scene with the detachment that came after you'd been trained to witness your own survival. Mercer appeared at the end of the hallway, his face a mask of rage. "Get her out of this hospital. Get her out now. And call security, have her arrested for practicing medicine without a license." Danielle met his eyes as they dragged her toward the service elevator. Her scrubs were clean except for one small streak of Torres's blood on her sleeve. Her hands, when she looked down at them, were absolutely steady. "The reversal is already working," she said. Her voice was so calm it sounded like she was reading the weather report. "Atropine is counteracting the bradycardia. His rhythm will stabilize completely within the next 30 minutes. You might want to check on that before you file any more false reports." The elevator doors closed. The last thing she saw was Mercer's face, white with fury and something else, something that looked like the awareness that he'd just been seen completely, that the quiet nurse had recognized exactly what he'd done and that he had no power over her recognition. The basement level received her. Fluorescent lights flickering with the hum of electrical current. The security guards released her at the exit to the staff parking area, their expressions confused, uncertain whether they'd just been part of something noble or something deeply criminal. Danielle walked out into the Denver night air. The temperature had dropped to 43 degrees. Rain was beginning to fall, light and persistent. Security grabbed her arms before her hands even left Torres's chest. One guard on each side, pulling her backward while her fingers were still reading the monitor, still feeling for the pulse she'd just restored. The hallway tilted. The fluorescent lights above seemed to pulse in sync with the sinus rhythm now steady on the monitor behind her. "Unhand her," Torres whispered from the stretcher, his voice paper-thin but conscious. His hand reached out, trembling. "Valkyrie?" But Mercer was already between them, his face flushed the color of raw meat. He turned to Danielle with his eyes narrowed to slits. "You violated protocol. You contaminated the sterile field. You touched a patient without authorization." She didn't argue. Didn't explain. The guard's grip was firm enough to bruise, and she knew bruises would matter less in the next 72 hours. She'd learned long ago that some battles aren't won with words. "Your shift is done," Mercer said, his voice dropping to something intimate and vicious. "Walk to HR. Now." The rain had started in earnest by the time she made it to the locker room. Danielle peeled off her scrubs, the one stained with Torres's blood, the one she'd worn like a second identity for 6 months, and stuffed them into the biohazard bin. Her badge hung on a lanyard around her neck. Captain Danielle Ross, registered nurse. The lie and the truth compressed into a single laminate. She knew what would happen next. She'd seen it before, had studied the patterns in other operations. A fired employee was a loose thread, and loose threads got pulled until someone started talking. Mercer would move fast. He'd activate his network, the board members he golfed with, the hospital administrators who'd hired him because his name came with prestige and billing power. A single phone call from a department head carried weight. Multiple calls from multiple directions looked like consensus. Her phone buzzed at 6:19 p.m. Unknown number. She didn't answer. Mercer had made his first call within an hour of watching her walk out of the ER. She found out later, much later, that he'd called the hospital board president during his evening martini at the Cherry Creek Country Club. The conversation lasted 8 minutes. "She's a liability," Mercer had said, his voice smooth as engine oil. "Unstable. Dangerous around patients. I've documented everything." The board president, whose name was Richard Ashford and whose son had attended medical school on Mercer's letter of recommendation, listened and nodded and said he'd handle it quietly. The next morning, Danielle's phone rang. It was someone from her nursing school at the University of Colorado. A reference check, they said. Routine credentialing question. Had she ever displayed erratic behavior? Substance abuse issues? Anger management problems? She answered each question with single words. No. 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 But the seed was planted. 3 more calls came that afternoon, from schools she'd attended, hospitals where she'd done rotations. Each one asking the same questions in slightly different ways. Each one reading from a script that Mercer had clearly written. By evening, her file at the Colorado Board of Nursing had a notation, credentialing concerns flagged by current employer. On the 3rd day, a woman named Patricia Holloway arrived at Cedar Creek Medical carrying a leather portfolio and the kind of smile that came with severance paperwork. She was an HR consultant, specializing in staff removals. She'd done it 23 times in the last 18 months. She knew exactly how to build a file thick enough to survive any appeal, any lawsuit, any question. Patricia didn't interview Danielle. Patricia interviewed everyone else. The nurses who'd been afraid to sit with her. The doctors who'd seen her touch a patient outside her scope of practice. The orderlies who'd witnessed her erratic behavior in the hallway, which was actually her performing emergency medicine while security was dragging her away. By the 4th day, the paperwork was thick. Documented. Time-stamped. Ironclad. Danielle received the termination notice on a Tuesday at 8:13 a.m. Gross negligence. Violation of nursing protocols. Unprofessional conduct. Incompatibility with Cedar Creek medical standards. She'd known it was coming. She'd been trained to absorb pressure without breaking, to maintain cover even when the walls were closing in. But what she hadn't anticipated was how absolutely, completely alone it would feel. Her mission was over. 6 months of carefully placed observations, of documenting Mercer's prescription patterns, of building a case against his opioid diversion scheme, erased. Navy intelligence would have to pull her before someone started asking questions about who she really was. The investigation into Mercer's kickback arrangements with pharmaceutical representatives would go cold. The evidence she'd gathered would be contaminated by her exposure. She'd been a ghost for 6 months. Now she was just a fired nurse with a black mark on her credentials. The rain came harder on Thursday night. Danielle sat in the hospital laundry room, the one place where no one would think to look for her, where she'd come on a pretext to return her final uniform. The industrial washers hummed their mechanical song. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like dying insects. She had 3 scrubs left in her personal locker. 3 sets of the identity she'd worn like armor. Danielle folded them one last time. Each crease was precise, hospital perfect. She'd learned to fold like this in the field, everything neat, everything orderly, everything controlled, because the alternative was chaos and death. Her hands had sutured wounds in sandstorms. They'd held the intestines of a 17-year-old Marine while mortar fire shook the walls. They'd performed a field thoracotomy with a combat knife on a soldier whose ribs had been shattered by shrapnel. These same hands now folded cheap cotton blend in a basement laundry room. The weight of mission failure pressed down like a physical thing. She'd had one job: stay invisible, gather evidence, protect the integrity of the investigation. Instead, she'd saved a life and blown everything apart. An entire operation, months of preparation, a decorated officer's chance at justice, all of it gone because she couldn't walk past a man having a stroke. She held the third scrub top in her lap and let herself sit with it. The basement was quiet except for the machines. No one came down here at night. She was alone in the way that only soldiers understand alone, surrounded by a world that had moved on, by people who'd never know what she'd actually done or who she actually was. Her hand moved to her locker, to the back corner where she kept it. The folded flag. The one from her teammate's coffin, the one from Corporal James Whitmore who died in her arms in Baghdad, asking her to never stop fighting for those who couldn't fight for themselves. She'd kept it through 6 moves, through 3 deployments, through a career that had turned her into someone who could save lives and still feel like a failure because she couldn't save them all. She almost threw it away. Not literally, she wasn't that broken. But she thought about it. About letting go. About walking away from Navy intelligence, from classified briefings, from the endless weight of knowing things she couldn't tell anyone. About just being Danielle Ross, registered nurse, instead of Captain Danielle Ross, undercover operative. About a life where no one ever asked her to bleed for a mission again. The flag was warm in her hands. Worn soft by years of handling. Mercer had one. That was the thing that sat coldest in her chest. He'd protected his operation by eliminating the threat. She was gone. The investigation was dead. He'd move forward, probably to his next posting, his next hospital, his next set of kickbacks, and no one would ever know what he'd actually done. She heard the sound before her mind registered what it was. A low thrum from somewhere far away, growing steadily louder. A helicopter. Close enough now that the basement walls seemed to vibrate with it. Danielle's hand stilled on the folded scrub top. She had no idea what was about to happen. She had no idea that Captain Michael Torres had opened his eyes in the cardiac ICU and asked for the nurse who saved him. No idea that the Marine Corps liaison at his bedside had already placed a call to Naval Criminal Investigative Service. No idea that a Black Hawk was inbound to Denver, carrying a rear admiral and 2 special agents who knew exactly who she was. She sat in that laundry room, holding scrubs that no longer belonged to her, listening to rotors that were about to change everything, and for the first time in 6 months, she allowed herself to breathe. The rotor wash hit the ER parking lot at 2:06 a.m., and the entire hospital felt it. Windows rattled. Loose papers scattered like frightened birds. Nurses stopped mid-stride and looked up, that instinctive awareness that something massive was descending from the sky. Cedar Creek Medical didn't get helicopter arrivals at this hour. Not unscheduled ones. The Black Hawk touched down on the designated pad, and before the rotors had fully spooled down, a man in dress blues emerged, Rear Admiral James Halloway, his cover polished to a mirror shine, his presence the kind that made the air pressure change. Behind him, 2 figures in dark suits moved with the efficient precision of federal agents. Naval Criminal Investigative Service. Their badges caught the hospital lights like teeth. The laundry room door was still warm when they walked past it. Danielle didn't hear them arrive. She was in the basement, folding the last of her scrubs, pressing each crease with the muscle memory of someone who'd learned precision in a combat trauma tent. The fabric was soft from 1,000 washings. Blue like the sky over Fallujah. She smoothed the collar, then the sleeves, then folded it into a perfect rectangle. This was her last one. After tonight, she'd turn in her badge, sign the paperwork Mercer had prepared, and disappear back into whatever operational status the Navy assigned to failed missions. 3 minutes later, the intercom crackled. Code Blue, Trauma Bay 4. All available staff. Danielle's hand stilled on the scrubs. The code wasn't for her anymore. She had no assignment. No clearance. She was a civilian nurse in a folded uniform, and civilians didn't answer codes. But her hands were already moving. She didn't run. Running would have drawn attention. She walked through the corridors with the quiet authority of someone who'd calculated every step, and when she reached Trauma Bay 4, she saw Dr. Mercer bent over a stretcher, his face the color of old bone. The patient on the bed was Khalid al-Rashid. She recognized him immediately. The scar tissue on his left shoulder. The missing portion of his left ear from an IED fragment. The man she'd personally carried out of a burning compound in Baghdad's Jolan district, 2011, while rounds chewed through the wall behind her. The insurgent commander she'd saved because the Geneva Convention didn't care about allegiance, only that he was breathing and needed a medic. Mercer looked up at her, and something shifted in his expression. Not recognition. Calculation. Nurse Ross. You're not scheduled. Code Blue. I heard it. You're fired. You don't answer codes anymore. Patients in VFib. You need hands. The monitor showed the truth, rhythm breaking apart, jagged and chaotic. Mercer had already ordered the shock, but the defibrillator pads were placed wrong, and the 4-line was running into a vein too small to handle the drugs he was about to push. Danielle could see it in one glance, the way a trained eye read a battlefield. Everything about this code was wrong. Someone get her out of here, Mercer said. But Khalid al-Rashid opened his eyes. It was impossible. The man was seizing, his body convulsing against the restraints, and yet somehow his gaze locked onto Danielle's face. His lips moved, rasping out a single word that changed everything. Valkyrie. The room went dead silent. Her battlefield call sign. Her name was Danielle, but in Baghdad, where she'd operated under the 1st Battalion, 5th Marines, a dark horse, she'd been Valkyrie. The medic who moved through fire like it didn't exist. The one they'd called when someone was bleeding out. The one who saved people who weren't supposed to be saved. Valkyrie? Al-Rashid whispered again, his voice barely audible. You are Valkyrie. You held my hand. In the compound. I remember now. You held my hand. 6 doors down, Captain Michael Torres heard that voice carrying through the hospital walls. Torres had been sitting in his bed, chest monitors tracking his recovery after Danielle's hallway procedure, his memory still fractured from the traumatic brain injury in Baghdad. But something about that word, that name, something about it cracked through the fog in his mind. Valkyrie. He sat up, tubes pulling taut, and suddenly the images crashed back. A burning vehicle. Smoke so thick it was solid. A woman's voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. I've got you, sir. Hold pressure here. Stay with me. Her hands on his wound, steady as a surgical laser. Her face covered in soot, her eyes the only thing he could focus on. She'd pulled him from that wreckage while the building was coming down around them. She'd been tattooing her call sign on his forearm even then, the ink permanent because he'd wanted to remember her if he never remembered anything else. Valkyrie. The Norse warrior maiden. The one who chose the slain. Torres, a nurse asked, alarmed as he ripped at the monitors. Captain, you need to stay in bed. But Torres was already on his feet, already moving toward the sound of that voice, already remembering who had saved his life. The Marine Corps liaison officer who'd been assigned to Torres's room stood up. His name was Gunnery Sergeant Derek Mitchell, and he'd been carrying a sealed folder since arriving at Cedar Creek Medical. He didn't have permission to open it. Not yet. But the moment Torres stood up, the moment al-Rashid whispered that call sign, Mitchell knew the moment had arrived. He stepped forward in front of Mercer, his dress blues crisp enough to cut glass, his bearing the kind that made doctors very aware they weren't in charge anymore. Dr. Mercer. You need to step back. This is my patient. This is my... Not anymore. Mitchell opened the folder. His voice took on the formal cadence of military citation, each word deliberate and precise. Captain Danielle Marie Ross, United States Navy. During combat operations in Baghdad, Iraq, January 2011, this officer demonstrated extraordinary heroism under fire. Mercer's face had gone white. Mitchell continued. Personally neutralized 2 enemy combatants while providing emergency trauma care to wounded Marines. Extracted Captain Michael Torres from a burning vehicle after IED detonation. Provided field resuscitation and surgical intervention to 14 service members, preventing 7 confirmed deaths. Torres stood in the doorway now, his hospital gown torn, monitor wires hanging from his chest. His eyes were on Danielle's face, and the recognition there, the sudden, crushing awareness of who she was, changed his expression like a door slamming open. "You were there," he said quietly. "You were the one." Mitchell pressed forward, his voice louder now, filling the room. "Awarded the Navy Cross. The Silver Star. 2 Purple Hearts." He paused, giving each decoration its own weight. "And the Medal of Valor from the Department of Defense." The door to the trauma bay swung open. A rear admiral in full dress uniform entered, and without hesitation, without even acknowledging Torres or Mercer, he rendered a perfect salute directly to Danielle. Crisp. Formal. The kind of honor reserved for those who'd earned it with blood and sacrifice. Behind him came a woman in a dark suit. Pentagon credentials. She stepped forward, her voice steady and official. "Captain Ross. Naval Criminal Investigative Service thanks you for your service." Then her eyes moved to Mercer. "Dr. Raymond Mercer. You're under arrest for pharmaceutical fraud, insurance conspiracy, and attempted murder." Mercer exploded. "Privacy violations. You cannot, this is a violation of, get security, get them out of my hospital." He lunged toward Danielle, his face twisted, spittle at the corners of his mouth. "This is a hoax. She's a fraud. A nothing nurse playing dress up. You have no evidence." The agents moved with the unhurried precision of people who'd arrested plenty of doctors before. One reached for his wrist. The other read him his rights in a voice like a tax collector, flat, professional, indifferent to his rage. "You have the right to remain silent. I'm calling my lawyer. I'm calling the board president. You can't do this to me. I'm chief of emergency medicine." The agents exchanged glances. They'd seen this before. The moment when the powerful realized power had evaporated. When the safety net that had held them for so long suddenly wasn't there anymore. As they led Mercer toward the elevators, a nurse in the hallway was filming on her phone. Just a moment. Just a 30-second clip. A doctor screaming about lawyers while federal agents walked him past the staff he'd terrorized. His face. His voice. His complete unraveling. By 4:13 a.m., that video had been uploaded to a healthcare workers forum. By 6:33 a.m., it had spread to Twitter. By noon, it was viral. Dr. Lawrence Chen, Mercer's former medical school mentor at Johns Hopkins, the man who'd written his recommendation letter, who'd been proud of this student's trajectory, saw it during his lunch break. He watched Mercer scream about privacy violations while dragging a decorated military officer by her arm. He watched a rear admiral render a salute to a woman in scrubs. By 1:36 p.m., Dr. Chen had posted a statement on his official Johns Hopkins account. "I take full responsibility for my failure to recognize the character of Dr. Raymond Mercer. He does not represent the values of this institution or the medical profession. I am directing my attorney to contact any and all parties harmed by his actions. His medical degree is a stain on Johns Hopkins, and I am formally requesting his board certification be revoked." The statement included a photograph of their graduation ceremony, 1998. Mercer's arm around Chen's shoulder, both smiling. Chen had crossed it out with red pen. Cedar Creek Medical's board president received 17 calls before 2:41 p.m. Hospital accreditation bodies. State licensing boards. The Joint Commission. the hospital's insurance carrier. Each one with the same message: investigate Mercer. Investigate your oversight. Investigate your systems. By Tuesday, the board had commissioned an external review. By Wednesday, they found the first discrepancy. By Thursday, they found the second. By Friday, they'd uncovered 6 years of opioid diversion, fabricated prescriptions, kickback payments from pharmaceutical representatives, phantom surgeries billed to Medicare, inflated trauma codes to justify ICU admissions that never happened. $847,000 in fraudulent billing. 14 nurses who'd complained about medication counts and been pressured into silence. 12 patient families seeking damages. One doctor teaching CPR classes at a strip mall urgent care in Tucson, Colorado, by month's end. The name tag said Steve. He wore it turned slightly inward, so the letters weren't quite visible. When a patient asked if he was the same Raymond Mercer from Denver, his hands shook. He said nothing. He just kept demonstrating chest compressions on a plastic dummy, pressing down, counting, 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. No one answered when he spoke. But Cedar Creek Medical was transforming. The hospital board approved a new Veteran Affairs wing. Free trauma care for active duty and discharged service members. A partnership with the Navy Medical Corps to station a permanent liaison at the hospital. New oversight protocols for controlled substance handling. New mentorship requirements for attending physicians. New reporting systems that protected nurses who spoke up. On a Thursday in November, Danielle stood in the hallway outside Trauma Bay 1, checking before on her patient, a 62-year-old diesel mechanic with a perforated ulcer. She was wearing scrubs again. Blue ones. The hospital had requested her return. The Navy had requested she complete her mission with honor and transparency instead of shadows. Captain Michael Torres had requested she stay. The mechanic looked up at her. You saved Torres, didn't you? The captain everyone's talking about. He saved himself. I just helped. No, You did more than that. She didn't answer. She adjusted his morphine drip, 5 milligrams for push, and moved to the next room. In the break room, 3 nurses were sitting together. When Danielle entered, they didn't leave. They didn't grab their lunches and evacuate. They smiled. One made room at the table. Another offered her coffee. How was your shift? The first nurse asked. Long though. The third nurse glanced down at Danielle's wrist, where she wore a military challenge coin on a surgical mask lanyard, her combat medal, nested between her identity and her purpose. She didn't hide it anymore. That's real, isn't it? That's actually. Yeah. Thank you for that. Danielle took a sip of coffee. The words didn't need acknowledgement. The work was the acknowledgement. The healing was the answer. She could feel it in the way the nurses had stopped whispering when she entered rooms. The way patients trusted her without hesitation. The way the hospital had changed its spine. Later, at the end of shift, Captain Torres was waiting in the parking lot. He was in civilian clothes, jeans and a button-up, but his bearing was still military. Still precise. He'd been discharged 3 weeks ago, cleared for limited duty, but he came back to the hospital every Thursday. To see Danielle. To sit with her in the evening light, the Denver skyline sharp against the sky, and not speak. He didn't need to. Some silences are louder than anything. I got your number tattooed on my arm, he said quietly, looking at the letters on his forearm. I didn't remember why. I know. I was going to have it removed. I thought it meant something else. Something I didn't want to carry. And now? Now I'm getting it redone. Bigger. Your whole name. Not just the call sign. Danielle looked at the sky. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. Years of holding things together. Of keeping secrets. Of being nobody so that others could be safe. It was all releasing now, and she had no choice but to let it go. We should get dinner, Torres said. We should. The coincidence of that moment, a casual invitation, a simple answer, the beginning of something that had no classified parameters or operational boundaries, felt like a different kind of heroism. The kind that didn't require salutes. The kind that just required showing up and staying. Danielle went back inside to finish her charting. A patient in Bay 6 needed vitals. Another in Bay 8 needed discharge paperwork. The work was endless and routine and exactly what she needed. She was Captain Danielle Ross. She wore scrubs instead of combat gear. Her patients were civilians instead of Marines. But the mission was the same: hold people together until they could stand on their own. The ones who have seen the worst often give the most. And sometimes, the greatest warriors look like nurses, with tired eyes and steady hands, moving through a hospital like it's a battlefield that can actually be won. If you're still watching, hit that like button. And I want to know, would you have saved the man who fired you, or walked away? Drop your answer in the comments. Subscribe and let's see how this ends.